Hi there, and welcome on the journey to transform culture. I'm Steve, and I'll be your guide. Well, folks, I hope you're having a fantastic day and an even better week. Today, folks, we're going to jump right into intergenerational wounding. I know, right? That's like going to the smorgasbord of issues all rolled up into one, like a like a 10,000 ingredient burrito, right? And we're not going to focus on every ingredient within the burrito, but we are going to touch in general about intergenerational wounding. Not only as, I mean, this obviously applies as individuals and friend groups and families, but we're going to start with organizationally, and then we'll kind of pinwheel out of that, depending on where the road takes us. Right. All right. So intergenerational wounding. Let's talk about it relative to organizations to begin with. So, if we think about intergenerational wounding, well, okay, let's say you have an organization that's been around for decades, right? We'll say 40 or 50 years. That organization is a direct reflection of the people who began the organization, right? Typically, if you go back far enough, a lot of organizations of any longevity and scope typically were family, generated from a family who created it, potentially sold it off, and so on and so forth. But it had a culture, it had a character to it, right? And much of that character was derived from its origins, its founding. Okay. And if we're looking at organizational wounding, all you have to do is to go back in time and look at individuals and how we lived and how we thrived and how we struggled, right? We dealt with racism decades ago. I mean, it's still out there, but it's not to the level that it was, right? Going back in time. You have sexism, right? Where women couldn't even be heard. And I mean, you want to talk about not being heard, not having your ideas out there going back many decades. Now it's a completely different world on both of those fronts. And you go back, and even to the extent that you take those two things and set them off to the side for now, is that any other ism that falls in there essentially follows the paradigm of ego. And the paradigm of ego follows basically the paradigm of fear. So it's one thing in current day to use systems and a plan and have a roadmap to accomplish objectives. That's one thing. It's another thing to create that in a fearful way. That is what you may have seen in the past is you had many more people working in an organization. It wasn't a flat org chart. So that means potentially the competence level wasn't as high, right? And in fact, it may not have been high because they were just beginning to create this organization. So they probably didn't have much to build with. Initially, they had to go off, they had to basically over resource something. And then over time, it became a little leaner as they went. But when you look at the ego and you look at the fearful context of that, this is where you get a lot of that intergenerational wounding. So it derives from stress, it derives from anxiety, it derives from that fearful nature, like, oh my gosh, we got to serve the customer, we're going to be late, right? That's completely a fear mindset. And this is a lot of what our organizational cultures and past businesses, and some who are still out there today, right? They know who they are. They have this ingrained within their culture. So much so that the employees are, say, afraid of management, or management are afraid of ownership, and the ownership, da 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 da, right? And it's not even a matter of being customer centric, because it's kind of like this. You don't want to anything that's made in fear carries that energy with it, right? You make a product, and somebody's under duress or stress, they're not focused. And what does that mean? That means your quality is suffering. So anywhere there's fear, there is a quality issue, and you may not even have known it or found it yet, but it's there. Trust me, it's there. And the quality element of this may not be in the product itself. It may be in the process. It may be in the paperwork. It may be in the in the billing, it may be in the quoting, it may be infiltrated. Where there's fear, there's inefficiency. Okay, this intergenerational wounding, right? You spiderweb this out into individuals now coming into the organization, and then they have their own wounding. Perhaps the dad was high stress, he's doing the job, he's high stress, this stress bleeds over into the kids. Now these kids are wounded. Why do I say that? They're wounded because they're conditioned, right? That wound now has been a conditioning, and some will wear their wounding like a red badge of courage, right? They'll get out into the work world and they identify the organization that they are happy to be a part of, at least initially, because why? They're treated in a stressful way, the way they may have been treated at home, right? Everything was stressful, everybody was under stress, so therefore that stress carries over. We're in organizations and from leaders, managers, and team members who didn't have that, who understood some of these things, were obviously able to, filter some of this out, put it in the proper context. But irrespective of that, they stayed in these organizations because why? It was familiar. Why was it familiar? Because that's how dad treated me, or that's how mom treated me, and the organization treats me this way. This feels like home. See how upside down that gets? This is where that generational wounding comes in. Somebody stays with that job, now they have kids, and as their kids are getting older, what do they tell their kids? Well, you just have to suck it up and deal with it, right? because that's what you do. You just suck it up and deal with it, because the end result of providing for your family, yourself, is more important. And there's not negating that as a fact, but the core purpose or core reasoning behind perpetuating that isn't because of what they said, it's because of their fearfulness to say, leave an organization that had basically been playing on their generational wounding. So you see how these things play together. All you have to do is pinwheel it around, and where you can find an ism in life, you can find where there's a wound, right? Now, exacerbate that more by turning that into women who hate men because mom hated men because the men they worked for were potentially, swarthy characters, let's say. Not all of them, right? Let's not overgeneralize and project. But we do know there were some, right? No doubt. But now this is what now bubbles up and becomes a resentment, and now a hatred. And now what have you done? You've taken one type of intergenerational, generational wounding, and you've converted it over into something else, to where now, well, all men are evil, right? Or all women are evil, or all this are evil, or all that are evil. You see where I'm going with this? And this is how we get off in tangents. And everybody's got their story now. And rather than deal with their core issue, their root causes, and going deep within that and go, okay, then, and resolving those and come to terms with those what? Bleed through in the organization they're in. And folks can wear masks very well. They can pull it off. They can pull off Halloween like nobody's business, right? They can wear masks. They can be as cool and calm and collected, and have no issues appearing, to be going on. But behind their eyes, behind the scenes, in their heart, they have what? These wounds that that they haven't dealt with. So now, what are other ways that can bleed out? OCD. Well, who hasn't known someone who's OCD, right? Or mildly OCD, or just, marginally OCD, right? I don't know if marginally OCD is a good thing. I don't know. I don't know, maybe not couched in that. If we say well organized, that's one thing, but what's the driver of an OCD though? It's fear, right? It's, I have to get it clean. Why? Because there's some kind of, haunting thing chasing me that if I don't get this done, whether that be a bad experience, intergenerational wounding, or now look at the organized person, somebody who wants to be organized and efficient, now does so because that is better. That is, the more efficient way to accomplish what we're doing. There isn't a fear-based motivation to it, right? What you can also see too is a little projecting. So you have a scenario where Some who are highly organized then get projected as, well, so and so is very OCD. Well, they're not OCD. If it's not fear based and they're not running, doing things, in a fearful way, and they're not anxious, and they're not, we can all pick up on what's fearful and what's not. If you're focused on the customer to do good work, to have good outcomes, right? To do well for the customer, right? And our customers, also our teammate, also our organization, also, everybody involved. It doesn't matter who you are, whether you're making the product, whether you're administrators, whether you're managers, leaders of the organization, or owners, right? Doesn't matter where you're at in that. If you have a fear-based motivation and your language reflects fear, well, then you're going to pass that on to your organization and people in it. And now, not only was there potentially organizational wounding from individuals from how they were raised and so forth, right? And conditioned, right? So if you're conditioned to believe of such a thing, and then such a thing happens, but it isn't from a place of fear, well, now people project fear, overlay fear onto that, right? They overlay an individual as, say, being authoritarian. So one way people, for example, are fearful of authority. Well, just think about it. What does it mean to have authority? It means potentially I'm responsible for the entire operation, and so I'm in charge of setting things up and lining things out, making sure you have resources, da 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 da. Right? The same way you would grow a garden. Do you think a garden, a garden could talk? Do you think that whole notion would be like, well, they're the authority over me? Well, they're also the thing that's feeding you, watering you, fertilizing you, da, 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 all of this, right? So, so when you project onto the gardener, right? You're projecting onto the gardener a negative or nefarious thing. That's not fair either, because now you're just reinforcing a generational wounding that you brought to the table. See how these loop around? And so what individuals and teams and organizations have to do is dig back into it, on their own or as a group, decide amongst themselves. But to understand what was organizational wounding. Well, in the past, we've had, leaders that didn't treat the employees so well. We've had employees that didn't treat each other so well. We've had, you see where I'm going with that? You don't have to name names. You just have to explain this is who we were. This is what has occurred in the past, and this is what we want in the future. This is our resolution to all of this, right? In my book, in the second chapter, what are you here to? I tell you straight out, what's your purpose? If you didn't know what your purpose is, I'll remind you again today in this video. You're here to protect love. You may be thinking, what? That's corny. That's cornball. What are you talking about? Protect love. I'm working at a job. This is a job. What do you mean love? A job? Well, don't you do that job? Provides resources for yourself, your significant others, your families, your friends, your community, right? Your civic organizations, your church, right down the line. Don't you love those things? You do. So if you don't think you're here to protect love, you've deluded yourself. The only reason you would put up with all of that is because of love or fear and intergenerational wounding, generational wounding, right? Whether it was from your own life or whether it was from those that you work with and who you toil with. Now, it's even worse in an organization if you have a few people who had these similar experiences. Why is that? Because you have organizations who kind of look for people who fit this mold. Why? Because their wounding, these people align with their wounding, right? Probably part of their wounding, say in some instances, not every, right? Of those leaders and owners, part of their wounding is treating people poorly, being domineering, being dictators, right? Being ugly, just being harsh people, definitely not, doing it for love. It's about the power. It's about, I have a business and I have the power, and this props me up. It's never about love. And you can always tell the difference between somebody who says, if they have love in their life versus somebody who's all about the power and the look of a thing, right? It doesn't mean you don't care about the look of a thing. It doesn't mean you don't have the responsibility and accountability to, wield control to make sure customers are served, but you have the genesis. If it isn't from love, you're doing it from the wrong reasons. Now, I posted a few times some slides on LinkedIn and Facebook and other places. 71% effectiveness. US businesses are 71% effective. The rest is scrap and all kinds of issues. Mostly, about 80 some percent, are human factors. Why is that? Well, take and deconstruct the organizational wounding, and you find people are doing things right in their organizations because of fear and all these anxiety driven things. Even people who have been part of organizations who leave organizations, right, are running away from dealing with the issue. Now, there is a point where you're trying to maybe if you're a change agent in that organization, you're trying to help transform them, and they get to a certain place, and you can tell they're not really willing to grow past a certain point, and you may say, okay, well, I've done all I can do here, and then you depart. There's a fine line between that and people who run away from situations. Why? Because of the generational, we'll say activated, not triggered, right? They're activated because the people who are, say, running an organization or certain people in it, they're bullies potentially, right? And nobody's done anything about it. In fact, the organization might be protecting the bully because the bully's a subject matter expert, right? And organizations don't want to give up subject matter experts. They'd rather have that one underling, that one brand new employee. When I say underling, I don't mean in a negative context. I just the new person, right? They may say, "Hey, I'd much rather lose one or two of those than lose my subject matter expert." Well, that's part of that. It's part of that wounding. I'm afraid to change. I might be the owner of the company, but I'm afraid to address these core issues. Why? Because I'm afraid to lose that subject matter expert. Well, again, if you're doing things in fear and you have bullies in your organization who are spreading that same fear, why do you think you can't exceed 71% effectiveness? Now, when I say 71% effectiveness, some may be saying, oh, well, we've got much better than 71% effectiveness. Okay, get rid of the firms, get rid of all the tax gimmicks, all that allow you to write off much of the things that cause you waste, and organizational expenses, right, to some of these firms for hiring new employees and all of these things. And the cost and time that are being sucked away from your current employees to train these new ones, especially if you have an OJT program, and it really doesn't matter, but OJT, definitely. So that's time and attention and to quality that's moving away from your customer focus onto what? You putting out a fire that you created. Why? Because you didn't deal with these issues. So you essentially are creating a snowball effect. And everyone in the chain, from the owner all the way down to the team member, it's a we, not a me scenario. It's a we're one team or we're not a team. And if you're not a team, this is partly why the performance is so poor right now. And it doesn't matter how much subtle waste, say material waste, right? You could clean up all the material waste. You're still left with 80+% of human factors that are gumming up your processes and procedures, and your HR racing around in circles, rehiring and hiring and rehiring and hiring and rehiring, right? Versus solving the issues that are causing all the hiring and rehiring to begin with, right? And then maintaining that and building upon that. So these and the money that you're throwing at some of these functionals to deal with what? Inefficiency. You're paying people to deal with inefficiency, not to improve it, but just to maintain it so you don't lose ground. That's a scary place to be. And that's partly why some organizations are operating from a fear mindset. This is part of the reason why these intergenerational wounds are so significant to organizations, because organizations, like any individual, have a generational aspect to them. Employees of now, employees back then, and so forth and so on. And if you're a new company and you're bringing some intergenerational wounding, even in the most subtle forms, you're apt to bring some of your bias in there that are likely to upset, some of the apple cart when it comes to your effectiveness as well. So even if you're shooting 85%, you can still improve, right? None of us are perfect. That means what? That means we always have to be proactive. We always have to be alert to these things. And we always have to be what? Fertilizing, watering, and feeding our garden and doing, and maintaining it and all of the good things, right? If you're not doing that, if you're not gaining ground, you're losing ground. All right. All right, folks. Well, that's going to be it for today. Remember, hit that good green domino 3 to 5 times a day to uplift, motivate, inspire, and just encourage folks. And when you do that, not only are you helping to transform culture in a positive way, right, protecting love, but you're also transforming yourself in the process. And that is an amazing thing. All right, hit like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, we'll talk to you later.